Okay, welcome everyone to another meeting of the Online Peace Science Colloquium. I'm Chelsea Estancona. I'm an assistant professor at the University of South Carolina, and I co-organized the series with Brad Smith, who is an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University. So this seminar has been, or this colloquium has been around since 2015, and it began as part of a meeting of the Peace Science Society, which decided it would be really great if we could extend the annual meeting to an online setting and allow for increased community efforts and really bring in some different scholarship. And so we've had really successful meetings since that time. So you can visit our website, you can follow us on Twitter. In particular, if you'd like to go back and watch any of this recording, we do record all of our sessions. So you'll be able to engage with this paper in the future and make sure if you have questions or comments that you can contact the authors as well. So we have a fantastic paper and wonderful discussants today. Our paper is titled, Targeted Sanctions, Resource Substitution, and Violence Against Civilians, Localized Evidence from African States. And our two co-authors are Jerry Urtuzuastigui and Koren, and they are both from Indiana University at Bloomington. And then we have two wonderful discussants. We have Menevis Cilizoglu, who is an assistant professor at St. Olaf College, and we have Brendan or Skip Mark, who is an assistant professor at University of Rhode Island, and then I'll add in some discussant comments as well. So just a little bit about how the audience can participate. So we invite you at any time to leave comments or questions in the chat, and I'll do my best to monitor those once we open it up. And if it makes sense, I'll try and integrate those with discussant comments as well. So we do prioritize our discussants, but we certainly want this to be beneficial and get as much feedback as possible for these authors. So they will be presenting for 15 minutes at this time. We'll then have our discussant comments, and then we'll open it up to any questions from everyone. So I will go ahead and I'll turn this over to Jerry, who will get the slides going, and we'll listen to the presentation.
Okay, can everyone see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so again, the title of our paper is Targeted Sanctions, Resource Substitution and Violence Against Civilians, Localized Evidence from African States. And before I state the research questions, I just want to provide a motivating anecdote, which is an example of why we think it's important to grapple with how armed actors may respond to targeted sanctions. And so in 2012, the UN Security Council imposed a charcoal sanction on al-Shabaab, which is a rebel group operating primarily in Somalia. And it targeted charcoal because charcoal is one of the organization's principal sources of income. And the Security Council believed that if it could effectively coerce al-Shabaab economically, again, by targeting its main source of income, that it would undermine its ability to fight the government of Somalia and ultimately bring an end to the Somali civil war. And the result was that the sanction negatively impacted its revenue stream, and it threatened to significantly weaken its military capacity. And so what was al-Shabaab's response? It wasn't to allow its organization to collapse. It was to strategically shift from generating revenue from charcoal to generating revenue from other goods, particularly unsanctioned agricultural commodities. But al-Shabaab, of course, didn't own these resources. And so to secure access to these resources, the group utilized violent methods of extraction, including looting, extortion, forced labor, and so on, which led to a sharp increase in civilian victimization and overall human suffering. And so this is an example of, and other examples of what partly motivated this paper's research questions, which include how do targeted armed actors mitigate the resource constraining effects of targeted sanctions, and what are the unintended consequences of these strategies when it comes to the safety of civilians. And so before we could answer these questions, it was important to look at several bodies of work, including work on sanctions and resource constraints, and work on resource constraints and civilian victimization. And so what does the work on sanctions and resource constraints tell us? well, I'll be very brief here. The literature in non-conflict settings tells us that sanctions have the capacity to increase poverty and unemployment, decrease trade, and significantly reduce a target's income, for example, its GDP. And so overall, sanctions have the capacity to drastically reduce access to, a target's important streams of revenue from trade, from finance, from business, and so on, negatively impacting a target's spending capacity. And so what does the literature in conflict settings tell us? Well, it tells us pretty much the same thing, that the effect of sanctions have the capacity to reduce armed actors' ability to generate income. And so Escriba Fulch, Holtman and Pexon, and other scholars more recently emphasize and demonstrate that the resource constraining effects of sanctions on conflict actors can be substantial. And so we believe that the constraint on armed actors likely leads to a strategic response from them. And this is where the next body of research becomes important, the literature on resource constraints and violence against civilians in civil war, because it lends valuable insight into what these potential responses may be. And so the question is, well, what does the literature on resource constraints and violence against civilians tell us? I'll be very brief here again. It tells us that when armed actors face sudden resource shocks, they tend to use predatory and other violent strategies to prevent their organizations from collapsing. And in the process, they victimize civilians. And so, as we discuss in the paper, these resource shocks may include, military losses or biased intervention in favor of the rebel or the state, climate and food shocks, which Professor Koren has done a lot of research on, the incapacity to attack civilians, and so on. And as a result, violence against civilians may be committed to impose costs on the enemy, to shape civilians' behavior, and to acquire vital resources, again, to counter the effect of a shock to its resources. And so, we believe that because sanctions constrain resources and therefore constitute a resource shock, we believe the following questions are really important. Is there a link between sanctions and violence against civilians? And if so, what exactly connects the two? And so, as we discuss in the paper, there's a literature on the effect of sanctions in civil war-torn countries, and this literature is largely focused on how sanctions impact battlefield intensity, conflict duration, and the likelihood of a peaceful resolution, largely as a result of the resource constraining impact of sanctions. But it's ignored the potential link between sanctions and violence against civilians. And so we believe that, because sanctions ultimately constitute a resource shock, that their imposition threatens the durability of armed organizations, which forces actors to find alternative sources of revenue, necessitating the use of violence against civilians to secure these alternative sources of revenue. So this brings us to our theoretical argument. And the first thing that I want to note is not particularly insightful. It's conventional wisdom, and it's that natural resource and other revenues often fund warring actors' organizations, which sustains civil wars. And the UN Security Council, which seeks to end civil war, targets these resources with sanctions. And what this is supposed to do is it's supposed to diminish targets' revenues and therefore weaken their capacity to fight, either causing an organization to collapse or more likely forcing warring actors to negotiate an end to the war. And again, by targeting warring actors' revenues, UN Security Council sanctions constitute a resource shock. But as we emphasize in the paper, it's a resource shock for certain sources of income: charcoal, gems, financial assets, diamonds, and so on. And so what this does is this allows targets to reduce the reliance on sanctioned goods and to generate new revenues by appropriating other unsanctioned goods. And this is intended to dampen or eliminate the effectiveness of sanctions. And so what are these alternative sources of revenue? In this paper, we focus on agricultural goods, particularly cash crops. And the question may be, well, why? And as we note in the paper, other than timber, cash crops have not been sanctioned by the UN Security Council. And there may be humanitarian reasons for this. So if you sanction foodstuffs, for example, it could increase hunger, it could increase disease and overall human suffering. But there's widespread belief in the policymaking and scholarly community that they don't give rise to or sustain conflict because, among other reasons, they don't generate sufficient income or revenue. But recent research, a lot of it done by Professor Koren, demonstrates that cash crops generate substantial revenue and they can help armed actors sustain themselves. And so again, armed actors will likely seek to appropriate cash crops after being hit with a sanction. And so we argue that similar to appropriation efforts in non-agricultural areas, appropriation efforts in cash crop producing areas could be quite violent. And so the short-term goal here is to replenish lost revenue. It's not to co-op civilians to provide resources, which would be a longer-term goal. And then when you couple this with the fact that sanctions constitute a major resource shock, armed actors are likely to have unreasonably high demands that citizens are unlikely to voluntarily comply with. And so we believe that this leads to increases in civilian victimization to acquire these resources. And so we provide a couple of examples in the paper. So Al-Shabaab, as I just mentioned, the Taliban and other organizations use these strategies. So they may violently extort citizens, farmers. They illegally tax farmers, and if not paid, they use murder or subject them to extreme violence or imprison them. Again, if they don't pay these taxes, they may also violently seize crops and sell them in open markets. And a crucial aspect of our argument is that this likely happens during harvest periods, harvest months, because these goods tend to be harvested and sold seasonally. And therefore, it's when they tend to generate the most revenue. And so the pattern that we expect to see, put simply, is that when armed actors are hit with resource-constraining sanctions, they have incentives to replenish lost revenues by reducing the reliance on sanctioned goods and generating revenue by appropriating unsanctioned agricultural goods, and in the process, increase violence against civilians to secure access to these goods. And again, importantly, this is more likely to occur during times when resources are abundant, so during the harvest season. And so before I state the hypotheses, I just want to provide a brief comment. I want to briefly comment on the actors of interest in our paper. And so first are sanctioned actors. And so these actors are hit with resource-constraining sanctions. And so we expect these actors to engage in sanctions evading strategies. The second actor of interest are unsanctioned actors, and they're not hit with resource-constraining sanctions. So we don't expect them to engage in this kind of behavior. And the third set of actors include extra sanctioned actors. And so these are actors that, these are sanctioned actors before they were sanctioned and after they were sanctioned. So let's just say that, for example, an actor is sanctioned in 2009. Then we code them as an extra sanctioned actor in 2008 and before that. And if the sanction ends in December 2009, then it's an extra sanctioned actor in 2010 and beyond. And so we expect we don't expect these actors to engage in sanctions evading strategies because these strategies are only used as a result of the resource constraints caused by sanctions. So this leads to our hypotheses. And the first one is that sanctioned actors will increase rates of violence against civilians in cash crop producing locations following months of greater agricultural productivity. And hypothesis two, which is that violence against civilians by unsanctioned and extra sanctioned actors will be unaffected by cash crops and cash crop productivity. And so I'll hand it over to Orr now, who will discuss our empirical strategy and research design and so on.
Thanks, Jerry. Chelsea, how much time do we still have?
You have about 3 minutes.
Okay, well, so I'm going to try to be quick. So basically, what we try to do is we wanted to look at those different dynamics. So we matched GED data with sanction data. Jerry did that. So the Beer-Starker et al. Data set has all this information on sanctions. So for each actor at the GED, we matched whether they're sanctioned a given month, what type of sanction, efficacy, etc. for all the different types. So basically localized the sanction data to the groups perpetrating violence. We then use a data framework that Justin Sean and I released about a year ago. So we kind of focus only on Africa, African states, African locations, due to that availability, also because this is actually where most of the GED data is located as well. Well, we kind of matched cash crop locations, right? So specifically areas of those valuable unsanctioned crops, and kind of used greenery, so vegetation health to approximate productivity in those areas. So looking at the month, at the basically 0.5 degree level, so it's about 55 by 55 kilometers at the equator, and then kind of decreases its size as you move up or down. Controlling for profitable resources, so again, right, the kind of counter argument of looting of other resources, population item light, and then climate issues, and then violence, other history of violence. Did lagging, but the results are robust, kind of country fixed effects, the usual. Jerry, can you?
Yes.
Again, you can move forward. Just go to the plot. We can skip that part. Here's the table. But the key thing, right, is that once we do that, we find statistical results for that interaction, right? So basically, those cash crop locations experience a noticeably higher rate of violence against civilians during months of greater abundance, only by sanctioned actors. So we don't see those incentives for appropriation appearing in unsanctioned actors, or importantly, the same groups before and they're sanctioned or after the sanctions are lifted. So in other words, this seems to be constitute a specific behavior that at least associate only with sanctioned actors. Again, a theory and a case-based kind of evidence suggests that this has to do with those agricultural resources. And there is other research that supports that, right? There's Koren and Felter from the Philippines. There's there are multiple kind of studies that focus on that. And so, but again, right, being able to really show the substitution effect, again, or this dynamic, I think, really kind of approximate the substitution effect that we hypothesized, again, within the limitations of what we can do. Jerry, can you move to the next slide?
Sure.
And so kind of thinking about this, right, so thinking more of second order sanctions at the local level, right? So there's a lot of studies on second order sanctions, Brian earlier, right, Peskin, but really nothing that looks at the local level. And so this tries to do that. And it shows that there is importance, right? Because even if you don't see any changes at the country level, there's clear changes going on within it, right? And so sometimes you'd say, oh, well, the sanctions don't have those externalities. Well, you need to go locally to actually see that. And so that suggests the importance of doing more of those analyses. And then again, thinking from kind of a policy perspective, right? The ability to think more of human security with targeting sanctions, right? What areas are more at a higher risk if you sanction a group, right? Maybe there is a positive way, maybe you weaken it. Or what does it do? So you can design and implement more effective sanction regimes, presumably. And then thinking a bit more of those cash crops, which usually don't, again, there's stuff that makes it into the news, right? The diamonds, the blind diamonds are going to make it into the news. But nobody think of coffee or fruit or barley as a source of that. And so trying to highlight that. And so in terms of what we kind of hope, so we circulated this paper to specific individuals, and now we're just trying to get more general feedback on it as we proceed with submission and rejection process. That is the natural step in everything. So any comments you may have on how to kind of improve framing, or maybe thinking a bit more of the modeling, or cases that we can incorporate would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Jerry and Or. You can stop sharing. Yes, and we'll hear from our discussants now. So go ahead, Menevis.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Excellent presentation. I really enjoyed reading the paper. As someone who is interested in sanctions research and who loves peace science, I always love seeing sanctions being featured at peace science conferences. And thank you, Chelsea and Brad, for inviting me to discuss this paper. So I will just try to focus on the big picture of the arguments, I think, but it really feels like from the paper that I read, this feels like it's really close to be out there, like getting published. So I hope some of my comments are still helpful. So the way I see it, the argument follows in two steps, right? So the first one is sanctions are being imposed, which then leads these armed groups to look for alternative sources of income. And then the second step is, now that they're choosing agricultural goods, that would lead them to increase their levels of violence in the areas where these agricultural goods are located in. So I'm going to go one by one with these steps. So with the first one about resource substitution, it almost feels like there's an inherent assumption that these sanctions are working to cut these groups' access to these resources that they primarily rely on. So it's kind of almost assumed that sanctions are working to cut Al-Shabaab's access to charcoal, which would then force them to look for alternate source of funding. But if anyone is gonna evade sanctions, I would trust Al-Shabaab to do it, I guess, for them to really push for maintaining their charcoal access, because ultimately I would assume that these armed groups are the ones who have the infrastructure to essentially leverage the black market. They would have their connections, because I would expect that their initial access was also not purely legal, right? So I would assume that they are already operating in the shadows to an extent, and it might be easier for them to use their coercion and victimization to get charcoal instead of maybe some agricultural goods. And now that sanctions are in place, probably charcoal will become way more lucrative, right? It's a riskier business now. So the premium on getting charcoal should be higher, is what I would assume. So maybe then I would also expect to see some increase in violence for their use or civilian victimization or whatever is needed to get the charcoal, instead of trying to replace it with agriculture that wouldn't really be the same source of income in terms of like its magnitude, I would assume. So that would be like one of my questions about that first step. So about resource substitution, why agriculture and not push for evasion through the initial good that's being sanctioned? And the second piece is really to think about sources of income that's not directly coming from tangible goods, but I'm thinking state support in any way. So are there any other ways in which these armed groups can offset these costs of economic sanctions, even if we assume that they lose charcoal, for instance? Are there any other ways in which they can compensate these losses and then not deal with agriculture? Because again, it may not be super lucrative for them. There might be bigger chunks of money that they can get through other states, other friendly actors. So I guess the larger question then becomes like, have you ever like considered thinking about at least variation among some of these like armed groups to see if some of them would be maybe inclined towards gravitating towards these agricultural goods, but some might be having a better shot at offsetting these costs in some other ways that may be just more beneficial for them. I think that would be just like some quick resource substitution comments. And the other one is, I think in the presentation, now I have a better understanding of that second step about why these armed groups will need to use violence as they're trying to get access to these cash crops. In the paper, I had a harder time understanding why they would need to use violence to get access to these agricultural goods. Can't they just use other forms of corruption? Didn't they have any like established relationship with these communities? Are they just starting to use agricultural goods as a part of their income? Isn't it diversified in some way? Are they putting all their eggs into charcoal in the Al-Shabaab example? So I wonder like if there are any kind of pre-existing sanctions that they can leverage, which then may not really require a lot of violence for them to begin with. So I kind of want to learn a bit more about why they would need to be violent to get access to these cash crops. I would also assume that there won't be much surveillance coming from the government, the same level that maybe charcoal would have, or like some other golds and minerals and metals might have. So those are some questions about the two steps. And I have a couple more. And one is about this like distinction between sanctioned and unsanctioned groups. So it's kind of suggested in the paper that these unsanctioned groups don't have an incentive to alter their behavior compared to the sanctioned ones. But I would assume that they would. I don't know how they would act, but it may go kind of two ways. So one, maybe there's some armed conflict, like competition among armed groups. So if that were to be the case, then maybe seeing an armed group being sanctioned and potentially weakening might then create an incentive for them to act in certain ways, to maybe even weaken them more, knowing that they're going to go for these agricultural goods, try to compete them, like cut them out from these agricultural gains. So we may also see some reaction by these unsanctioned groups towards sanctions. At least like at the government level, there's a lot of literature that talks about these third parties and how they're being impacted by economic sanctions. So maybe there's not that of a stark difference between the sanctioned and the unsanctioned one. And the sanctions can also have some implications for other armed groups, which may then have implications for the targeted armed groups, if that makes sense. So that's kind of what I was thinking. And then lastly, kind of two more quick points. I want to give more time to Skip and the audience, but have you ever considered sanctions that are not being directly targeted on these armed groups, but sanctions that are on the governments that may be impacting the resource calculation of these armed groups? So I'm thinking like arms embargoes that's being imposed on governments, which may hurt the armed groups that are trying to get access to arms, or I don't know, any kind of sanctions that are weakening their hosts if they're supporting them. Any kind of weakening at the government level might also be a loss of revenue for these armed groups, and which may create kind of like a similar dynamic that you're presenting here. But yeah, I think I'm going to stop here. I'm curious to see what Skip has to say, but thank you so much for inviting me, Chelsea, and a great paper. I think it's just ready to be out there with some minor improvements, I hope.
Awesome. Thank you, Menevis. All right, go ahead, Skip.
Thank you for inviting me, and I will try and add something new. Those were good comments. So I'll start by saying I really like the argument of the paper, and I'm convinced by the empirical modeling strategy. This is a really cool paper, one I'm looking forward to teaching in class. So I'll mention some comments. I'll send along some additional ones afterwards. So I'm curious, how long after sanctions have been lifted do extra sanctioned actors go back to normal, right? So my guess is once they've developed an effective strategy for stealing these agricultural crops, it might take some time to go back to previous streams of revenue. And I'm curious, after they've been sanctioned, wouldn't they have an incentive to sort of diversify their revenue stream to avoid a similar risk in the future? Right, maintaining some access to some level of crop theft. So given the risk, like why go all in again on goods that could be sanctioned again? In line with this, I imagine pre-sanctioned groups would behave different than post-sanctioned groups. So I'm curious why you chose to combine them, and if you've thought or explored whether there are differences in their behavior. So that's the first point. The second one, so if a group gains a reputation for violence and crop theft, is the next instance of theft met with less resistance from civilians? So I'm reminded of Peter Leeson's book, The Invisible Hook, which describes like how pirates build a reputation for violence and allows them to steal without resistance. So, if you are really violent, ships surrender knowing that fighting back against certain pirates was too costly. So I'm curious if the groups that are the most violent or have the largest increase in violence in the beginning of the sanctions see a subsequent decline in violence over time because they built this reputation that citizens just shouldn't fight back. So I don't think this would change our findings, right? But it might add some nuance as it lines up with your argument. And I think it would also allow you to say something about the kinds of violence these groups are likely to employ, right? So rather than just theft and killing, this really has something to say about the potential for these groups to engage in tactics and levels of violence that reduce resistance down the road. So beyond killing, are we seeing things like rape, slavery, torture, and other tactics meant to terrorize and send a signal to citizens elsewhere that sort of reduces resistance down the road? A third part that kind of goes in line with this. So I'm not really sure if citizen behavior should be a part of this conversation. In the paper, you mainly discuss this in terms of methodological consequences. And, I agree, I think, I have no issues with that approach. But, in terms of the theory, citizens could fight back, produce less, change what they produce, leave, give up their crops without a fight. You mentioned Afghanistan, and in Afghanistan, farmers shifted to poppy production, in part due to pressure from armed actors. So you might also see these actors shifting the nature of production. So I'm left wondering what determines their behavior in response to citizen behavior in response to sanctions and sanctioned groups. I'm not sure this should be in the paper. You can only do so much in one paper, and I think you've outlined a good argument and a good test of that argument. But maybe, something in the conclusion, or maybe a follow-on paper that sort of looks at the other side of this. How do citizens behave? And the final question I'll pose is just the marginal effects plots and the discussion of the substantive size of this effect on page 25 are a little hard to interpret exactly how big this effect is, because you're taking count data and then you're logging it, and then you're looking at the change in the log. And so I think it can give the false impression that this is a relatively small effect, when actually, given the mean of your dependent variable and the size of your marginal effect, it's actually pretty large. So it makes me wonder, why not use a count model and report something like incident rate ratios, or the predicted number of events under low yield versus high yield? Or maybe a simpler approach would just be to transform these back into non-log numbers in your discussion of them. So most of these points are, I think the paper is really interesting, and I really want to know more about this process, rather than that I think there are any major things that you need to fix now. I think I agree that this is close to being ready to send out, and I'll send you some other comments after this. But great paper.
Yeah,
Wonderful.
You.
Yeah. Thank you, Skip. So I also have some comments for you all, if you'd like for me to go ahead and do that. Let me hold on. Let me make sure I have them readily available. Okay, so I'll try and also keep this quick, because I think our other two discussants have already given you lots of wonderful things. So selfishly, I love this paper in so many ways, because it unites what I think are could be perceived as disparate literatures, all of which I engage with in some way. So I'm like, this is awesome. This is like such a cool way to think about this. And I think also the paper gives a lot to build from. And so you're really creating an opportunity that starts in a wonderful spot. So thank you for providing this. So my comments are sort of related to some of the assumptions in the theory that then I think carry over a bit into the testing strategy. So I have some thoughts on that as well. To me, there's fuzziness around just two key areas. So the first would be the nature of non-state actor economies, and just kind of like what these markets for different kind of goods look like. And then the second would be about really what is the efficacy of violence against civilians. So I think both of those areas need a little bit of refinement in your argument. So Menevis already mentioned that there's this assumption about, switching to these cash crops is a viable or an alternate strategy. And you have like kind of this paragraph in there where it's like, well, continuing in these, or to build shadow economies is too expensive. It's a thing that rebels aren't going to want to do. I don't think that's true. I think we have lots of literature about rebels, immediate possibility of building shadow economies. I think often they've already done this by the time that they are sanctioned. I would really strongly suggest that you take a look at some of the criminal violence literature to establish kind of under what conditions are shadow economies more or less efficient. I think that would be really valuable here. But one citation that would probably help you here is Rachel Sweet's work. There's an article, I think it's 2021, where she does establish, listen, rebels tend to go through kind of legal state means. So I think that that would be helpful for you to bolster that argument, which right now I think is a bit weak. Substitution still requires us to assume some things about the goods themselves and about rebels' involvement to the access of these goods. So it's unclear. You kind of fudge a little bit. You sort of say, well, sometimes you can get local profit from these sorts of crops. Sometimes you can export them. That makes a big difference as far as, what is the access to the market that you're going to sell these goods in, and how profitable these goods are, these cash crops, as you're saying. And there's an assumption that diversification happens, pretty readily and easily, and then also that this diversification or substitution. So I'm a little wary of the substitution thing, that it only happens like post sanctions. So I think there's some work to be done in theoretically and empirically, certainly demonstrating that, as well as the whole local and international component. I wonder a bit more about, when does the substitution actually require violence? So this to me is based on, what is your assumption about how rebels have set themselves up economically even prior to sanctions? So if they're largely engaged in looting, I can see how they've already set up a reputation for being, violent in their kind of economic relationship with civilians. They might just shift it to a different area. But if they've been engaging in economic governance around another type of resource, this might be closely tied to their goals and to their reputation. So it's sort of unlikely to me that they would really quickly shift to civilian victimization. This is related to one of Skip's points. And even if they do so, for how long that would last, right? So we know that that's a costly strategy, especially given that most of these resources are labor intensive, if you intend to have like a long-term stake in these cash crops. Now, if you truly are just looting and stealing, I can understand this argument a little bit more, but I think you need to do some more work in demonstrating which type of rebel groups are willing to engage in this looting and stealing strategy, and whether those are the groups that would be likely to be sanctioned. So I think there's some concerns there. All right, I'll skip ahead a little bit to some empirical stuff that I think is related. Mostly, I would really love to see some placebo tests. So I think this could be useful for you. So first of all, test with other types of sanctions. So according to your argument, these should be this effect should be unique to targeted sanctions. This is tied to something that Menevis said as well. Is this just about changing the economic conditions under which rebels operate, which then changes their tactics, or is this the specific effect that you're finding? And so if it is in place for other types of sanctions, I think it raises other questions. I also want to see this for other types of crops. So just agricultural products in general. So is this about, we run out of money, so we steal food to feed ourselves, which is not quite the same thing? Or is this about, we are actually going to invest in these alternative cash crop economies? I'm really a little dissatisfied with your productivity variable because it's just, to me, capturing increases in vegetation, not specifically related to those cash crops. But I think something that you could do to help with this is, does the export of those cash crops from these states increase simultaneously with the changes in vegetation? That to me would demonstrate we're seeing these moments of change related to particular goods that these groups would like to seize. To a couple other really quick things, I think you need to be really careful theoretically about how you discuss the state versus non-state actors. There's not a lot of distinction there. And then you also need to separate out non-state actor types. So rebels versus militias are going to be drastically different in how they engage with civilians and also their economic goals in the short and long term. So I'd like to see a little bit more strategic discussion of how these groups interact, including a lagged term for other groups' violence in the models. So if it's a rebel group that you're looking at, are they responding to a militia in the area that is, also beating up on civilians, or are they responding to the state? I think that's going to be important. I think that I'll stop there in the interest of making sure we have lots of questions and comments from others. But the long and short of it is, I completely agree with my co-discussants. I think this is a fantastic paper, and there's just some small things to hopefully improve it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, all three of you. This is really great and a very useful set of comments. And yeah, I mean, as we said, right, issues with the framing and theory, especially, there's a lot of moving parts here. So this is really useful. I also like the empirical suggestions. We did a bunch of robustness tests, but I like the idea of some of the placebo tests and looking maybe at country level output. The only thing is, again, well, you might not necessarily see the output changing because it's the actor who's training it, not necessarily the output. But it's worth at least testing. So yeah, do you want us to respond to anything, or are we opening it for question? How does this work?
That is up for you, or up to you if there's something that you think would help others by responding to. Otherwise, you can choose to gather questions.
No, I mean, I don't think we have much. I mean, one thing I would say about the sanction efficacy, we do have our robustness models that look at the efficacy, and so it does seem like kind of stronger sanctions will make this effect stronger. So that might suggest that it's harder for them to substitute. So it's harder for them to pursue those alternative angles. But yeah, beyond that, I mean, I don't think I have much to add. Jerry, do you have any suggestions? I mean, I wrote everything down. So do you have any thoughts?
No, I think those are all really great comments. I was gonna make that comment as well. The more effective, when the sanction actually has an impact, you tend to see these behaviors. But when the sanction does not constrain resources, you actually don't tend to see any of these behaviors. But
you see them, but they're like not necessarily different. It's much noisier. Whereas if it's strong, like it really, I mean, we put it in a figure, which we could move the figure to the paper. I mean, it's right now, I think it's in the appendix, but that could be something in the paper to help with that. I'll write it down.
Okay, so I think I will, so I don't know that we have anything at the moment in the Q&A, but I'll go ahead and open it up so that anyone who is here who's not one of our panelists, if you have a question, now is your moment. Okay, let's see. All right. Not seeing anything as of yet.
We got a really good set of comments in any case. I mean, we're gonna definitely make sure to incorporate everything to at least the best of our ability, right? I mean, that's the other thing is like we were thinking of maybe trying to match it with other data set like ECLED, but that's just too many actors, right? So that would have been one way to separate the militias and the rebels. But I mean, we try. It's just not really feasible. So this is another thing, right? There's a bit of limitation, but beyond that, we'll do our best to do whatever was suggested here. Definitely with the placebos. I think this is a kind of an easy way of showing why it's not. Yeah.
I think so. Just while people are thinking, so two other like small things that I really think would be easy to add. I mean, I would love to see you include drug crops.
It seems like there is a question about.
Yeah, I had asked Jennifer to see if we could turn on mics so that would be it would be easier for Cliff to ask. In the meantime, Cliff, if you'd like to start typing so that we can make sure that we include your question, that would be awesome because I'll direct it right back to that as soon as we have it. So just while that's going on, I think perhaps like a list of the sanctioned and unsanctioned actors, or maybe even just highlighting a few would be great. So that we kind of know like just how does that process happen and who is included where, as well as I would love some maps, which I think is kind of a common ask, right? Because so it should be the case that you should see a shift in activity from these groups. So it should be that they are really active and violent around the kind of typical sources of revenue, and then they shift to being active elsewhere. So we should be able to see that. It'd be really cool to just demonstrate it with one or two groups. Even Al-Shabaab, that'd be fascinating. Yeah. So hopefully that's easy, and those are just like little value adds.
Yeah, the maps should be really easy. I thought we definitely had maps in earlier versions. It might have gone in the appendix at some point. I'm not sure. But if not, yeah, we can definitely add those. It's pretty easy to do. You can show productivity and violence by different actors. So I mean, it takes literally 5 minutes to plot. So those.
Okay, let me see if I can enable this for, let's see. So that we can get Cliff's question. Oh, hold on. Yeah, Jennifer, go ahead and let them talk. Yeah. Yay.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
You're good.
Excellent. So yeah, after typing, it's good to get on. So part one of the question. The case for this really hinges on there being on noticing that among sanctioned groups, there's a seasonal difference in their violence. And while for non-sanctioned groups, the violence seems to not vary or not be patterned with seasons. So part one of kind of where I'm going with this, since I haven't read the paper, does the method you're using associate those seasonal differences with the seasons in which those crops are being produced? So are you just noticing the seasonal difference and assuming it's when the crops are produced and you're doing that? Or do you actually have a way of, is it that these differences are associated with the actual production? So that's kind of part one.
Yeah, so the measure we use that Chelsea didn't like is the it's basically like vegetation. So it shows you, yeah, it's kind of a proxy for the local productivity. So it doesn't have to be, I mean, it's monthly, but it doesn't necessarily vary the season, right? So we have control for the seasonal trends as well. So if this was just fully seasonal, I would expand. So no, it's more of like locations that have more productivity, and then you look at over a month if there is more or less productivity within those locations.
So is this then associated with when it's green, there's more violence?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, within those locations. So it's specifically
okay.
locations when it's more green. Yes.
Yeah. So generally, crops aren't producing a lot of money when they're green. That may sound odd, but most cash crops, have to ripen. So, if you look at cornfields around Indiana or wheat fields, it's not until they've sort of turned brown that you harvest them. And then a little bit later is when when they actually start producing money and the money starts coming in. And this kind of ties into what I am a bit suspicious of. Is that there may be something you're picking up on that isn't really connected to the seasonal nature of the crops, and that it may be actually even connected to I don't know what this would be, but why the groups would end up getting sanctioned in the first place. Now, if that's the case, it's you've got a good case that it's groups before sanctioned and after sanctioned don't do this. But I wonder, and this kind of goes back to Chelsea's placebo test. If what else could this be? And if you just looked at, like in the United States, tax revenues, if you're looking at tax estimates being made, that those things are probably in agricultural communities pretty seasonal. If you look at other sorts of crime, they might actually be pretty seasonal and might have, in agricultural communities, might have a lot to do with the agricultural seasons. If that's the case, you're going to have a lot of areas that aren't agriculture that the violence wouldn't be seasonal in, or you wouldn't expect it to, or it wouldn't be seasonal in whether they're sanctioned or not. And that, so that what you're actually picking up is variation in what you're looking at in terms of your greenery, rather than in terms of where the actual, whether the rebels are being sanctioned or not. I don't know if I got all that out in a way you could see what I'm getting at or not.
No, I think I understand, right? That is that, like, you know, if you look at greenery, there's a lot, like there's potentially other things you might be actually approximating, right? We did lag it by 1 month, but that's not really necessarily a solution. I do think that there are some crops there that are more beneficial when it's green. It's also kind of an average. So it's not so, I mean, it's not just greenery, right? It's vegetation health. So it's not just because it's not just green pops on the screen and therefore it is. So it shows you how much of it is actually covered by vegetation, right? So it could be brown or green. I mean, we call it kind of a measure of greenery, but it's really more about how much of it is covered, right? So you, for example, you're gonna have period, especially around the Sahel, when there's just they burn all the stuff that's there, right? And so those will be kind of period that are relatively barren because they all the gray stuff was burned. But if you have before that, you look at it, you still have some levels of greenery. And so it's not just that it's capturing greenery, right? It does capture, there is more stuff in the fields. Could be that it's before it's right, but also when it's after. So in this regards, I think it does capture it. But you're right? I mean, we didn't even think honestly of the taxation element, which could be relating, right, not only to point that Chelsea was bringing up, but also to kind of general group governance, right? So it could be, I mean, the militias especially, right? Like, you know, they propose. So that is one kind of potential alternative. And so they become kind of more dependent on this versus other source of support potentially because of the sanction. And so, you know, the other thing is like when you have, so that's something that Colin Hendricks actually mentioned in a different paper a year ago. So it could also be that there's more money available, right? So if you have big farms, you have a lot of labor on it. If you have a lot of labor, right? So there is looting. So it's not necessarily about the resources, it's just about the fact that this is a good time to loot. I mean, I think, you know, all of those would relate still to the impact of sanctions, I guess. But like, yeah, I mean, it requires thinking a bit more, I think, carefully. And you're right. I mean, we try to get some evidence, but it's not easy to find evidence about what sanctions groups do when they go to agriculture. That's exactly kind of the issue, right? Is like we claim that it wasn't as highlighted. But I think, you know, I think those are really good points. I mean, I think maybe thinking a bit more of all the potential pathways or reasons that the groups might engage in violence, right? Sanction group compared to our sanction group might be an easier way to just think of selling the crops. Yeah, I think it's a good idea.
Yeah, and if you can still hear me, and if I can just push a little more on this, the other is, you know, I find it really hard to believe they'd be stealing crops. I mean, I in one way I don't, because people steal anything, but you know, it takes some fairly, they're not hard skills to learn, but fairly specialized skills to learn how to get crops out of a field effectively and at the right time and get them delivered to market and all that. And, you know, and especially if you're talking about export crops, you know, if you're talking about crops for local consumption, I think it would be, you know, rather than going and stealing tomatoes and then go selling them to somebody, I think it'd be a whole lot easier just to steal the money from the people who would otherwise be buying the tomatoes. Which, you know, so I guess I'm willing to believe that once I read the paper, I'm going to find your evidence fairly persuasive. And if it is, then I think you're really onto something, because you've got, you know, you're explaining something I would not have expected to observe. But it just sounds like kind of a bizarre story to me, where, you know, I'd steal diamonds, not tomatoes. But.
So it's not about them stealing, and with the tomatoes are not cash crops. So, but it's not about, you know, that there is a sourcing element, right? So as I mentioned, one of the cases that's been famous is timber, right? So what you have, and so we don't really mention it in the paper, but really what you have in Liberia is like, was the diamond issue. And so they sanctioned them with diamond. And so now they source timber, and then timber gets sanctions almost preemptively because of that. So again, right, it's not like they're stealing the trees out of the ground, right? There's a whole operation, but that operation, right, could induce appropriation. It's not necessarily that the rebels are running it, right? It's the civilians are running it. And so that is that you go and you can steal the supplies or whatever it is and then transport them. So that's the argument. So it's not that they're still sneaking in there to try and steal tomatoes from the, you know, and like Peter Rabbit, right? It's more of a general kind of idea of sourcing this, you know, to sourcing this, especially something that's valuable, right? In all of kind of agrarian regions, right? Obviously fruit is going to be valuable. And so you're trying to really capture the shipment. Or again, right, as you say, maybe it has to do with other resources that are also available during harvest as well. And I think that's what we kind of, that's what we're thinking on more, right? So we do have the evidence of timber as being the one example. Now, again, this is pretty rare, but it does seem to be associated with some agricultural crops as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
we have just a few more minutes, and I don't see any more comments at the moment in the Q&A. So I'll turn it back maybe to Menevis and Skip to see if y'all had anything, you know, that you didn't have time to say that perhaps you'd like to add.
All right. Two things I'll add. One is, you know, in the paper you talk about the potential for the groups to turn to the shadow economy, and it seems like, you know, empirically at least, this should undermine your ability to find a significant, like statistically significant relationship. And so I would have expected you to talk about that in the methods section, the same way you talk about sort of violence reducing the production of cash crops. And the other thing I've been wondering as I'm hearing some of this is, you know, do we see is there variance among groups in when this shift occurs? So if there's really high productivity, are all groups shifting? Whereas as productivity is lower, some groups shift and some groups turn to the shadow economy. And that might be a way to leverage sort of that different groups are choosing different strategies, but you still have evidence that some groups are adopting the strategy you say they are.
So that's actually interesting, because one of the things we were thinking of, and I think there is another way that people measure those agricultural productivity, is thinking anomalies, right? So not just the average changes in gradient, but you can think of anomalies. And so that might be actually one thing to test, right? If you have high anomalies, do you see all groups shifting, right? I think that could be an interesting idea, actually. Yeah.
So I'll do one suggestion if Chelsea lets me, because she did not mention this. I think one article that can help you get at less of these questions is actually Chelsea's ISQ paper that's doing a great job. I'm going to do a really poor job, Chelsea, so interrupt me at any moment, but really thinking about what happens. There are these like economic shocks into the system. I think you were looking at like commodity price changes and what does that mean for like rebels financing of their operations, and then their like kind of relationship with their suppliers, victimization. I think that discussion can help frame this a lot by getting at tons of comments that you've been getting so far. It's just like a really neat, the framing can help a lot, I think, with this paper. Or maybe Chelsea, if you want to add something about that.
I will always.
I'm sorry if I butchered your paper, but
no, I will always allow you to plug my work. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I certainly had sort of, I guess, selfishly said this as well, or I thought about this as well. Sorry, I think I was having a struggling internet connection for a minute there. So just thanks, Menevis. But yeah, you have this comment in the paper that I picked up on as well, where you said something along the lines of, many other forms of shocks that affect groups' economic situation are not confined to a specific commodity or are not confined to, a clear economic pathway. But demand shocks for a particular product are, right. And I know I don't have to tell you all this because I know you have work on this. Yeah, my paper looks at it. It is an illicit economy, but that said, part of the reason I'm pushing you to really think about, how does economic governance matter and how does the strategic interchange both economically and violently between actors matter is because those are kind of key components to the paper. So to the extent it can be helpful, by all means, please use it. But otherwise, yeah.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we're definitely going to add that.
Cool. So if you all would like to, we have just about a minute left. So if there's anything that you all would like to do in conclusion or any comments, I'll turn it back over to our authors and then I'll just wrap up really quickly.
Okay, Joe, do you have anything to say?
Other than thank you for the comments. I think that they're extremely valuable and our paper is going to benefit immensely from them. So thank you again. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, I second that. This is really, really useful. So we're going to see it later and kind of categorize them into which exactly parts they should go into, and what parts need to be added. So discussion of season, things like that. But yeah, no, it's really, really useful. We'll do whatever else we can with the data, to show robustness. But yeah, otherwise it's just been really useful. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, we're right at time. So thank you to our authors for really a fantastic paper. Thank you to our discussants and to our audience members as well. So we'll wrap up here, and I'll just let you know that you can go back and watch this video right from the beginning if you'd like to on the OPSC website, or we also have a YouTube page if you missed the start of the presentation. And certainly if you have comments or questions, feel free to engage with that YouTube page or to email our fantastic authors. So I hope you all have a great rest of your Friday, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future.
Thank you very, very
Thanks,
much
y'all.
again. Thank you.
Thank you all.